The crash of breaking glass rang through the mansion like thunder. Elizabeth Richards, the billionaire's young wife, stood in the grand living room of their Banana Island home, her gold bracelet glittering as she flung the last shard of a shattered vase across the marble floor. For months her voice had ruled this house like a storm, but now her chest rose and fell with a strange, shaky breath. Grace Thompson, the newest maid, stood at the doorway clutching a cleaning cloth. She had scrubbed every corner of this house, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of the madam. Eyes red from crying, diamond earring missing, hair tumbling loose. "Why are you still here?" Elizabeth's voice cracked, sharp but weak. 10 maids have gone. Why haven't you?" Grace tightened her hold on the cloth but said nothing. "Answer me," Elizabeth shouted, kicking a glittering shard. The sound echoed through the silent mansion. Before Grace could speak, a heavy knock boomed on the front door. "What?" Twice. Then a third time louder. Elizabeth froze. Grace's heart began to race. Midnight was no time for visitors. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. And then silence. 2 months earlier, the Richards mansion had looked like every housekeeper's dream. The gates of Banana Island rose high and white. Inside, chandeliers shone like captured stars. Richard Richards, Elizabeth's husband, was one of Nigeria's wealthiest businessmen. Newspapers called her the new queen of Lagos society. But behind those tall gates the staff whispered another name for her, the woman no maid could survive. 9 maids had left in 6 months. Some ran away in tears. Others were fired after only days. Elizabeth demanded spotless floors, polished silver, and silent obedience. A speck of dust could spark her fury. Grace Thompson arrived carrying a small overnight bag and a larger burden, a sick child. Her 9-year-old daughter, Deborah, waited for a costly heart operation at a hospital in Surulere. Grace needed the job no matter the danger. From her first morning Elizabeth tested her. She knocked a tray of water glasses to the floor and stared coldly. "Clean that. Quickly." Grace bent without complaint. Every day the tests grew harder. A missing uniform, false accusations of stealing a bracelet, insults flung like stones. "You will not last a week," Elizabeth hissed. Grace kept her head low and her heart steady. At night she prayed for Deborah's healing and for strength to endure. The cook, Mama Agnes, and the driver, Michael, soon noticed the quiet courage that kept Grace from breaking. One Sunday evening when the house was unusually silent, Elizabeth's temper snapped. She seized the tall crystal vase from the center table and hurled it against the wall. The crash shook the chandelier. Grace stepped back, the cloth slipping from her fingers. And then came the midnight knocking. The heavy knocks echoed through the silent house like a slow drum. Grace felt her breath catch. She could almost hear the rush of her own heartbeat. Elizabeth turned toward the door, her face pale under the bright chandelier. For the first time since Grace entered this mansion, the proud madam looked frightened. Another knock, 3 hard raps, made the front door tremble. "Who is that at this hour?" Elizabeth whispered. Grace swallowed. "Should I check, Ma?" Elizabeth shook her head quickly, then gathered her silk robe tighter around her. "No. Stay here." They waited. Only the distant sound of waves from the Lagos lagoon broke the silence. After a long pause the knocking stopped. Elizabeth let out a shaky breath and turned back to the scattered shards of the crystal vase. She pressed her palm to her forehead and sank onto the sofa. Grace slowly walked closer. "Madam, are you all right?" Elizabeth looked up sharply as if remembering who she was. The sharpness in her eyes returned, but it was weaker now. "Clean this mess," she said, her voice low. Grace nodded and bent to gather the pieces. She worked quietly, her fingers careful not to cut against the glass. Elizabeth said nothing. For the first time, the house felt heavy not with anger but with something Grace could not name. Weeks earlier, Grace's life had been far more chaotic than any night in Banana Island. Deborah's heart condition had worsened. The doctors at the Surulere hospital told Grace that surgery could not wait much longer. The bill, millions of naira, sat like a mountain she could not climb. Her small tailoring business barely paid rent. Friends had already helped as much as they could. Grace prayed each night, her knees sore from the cold floor. She needed a job that paid well and quickly. When she heard the Richards household was hiring again after yet another maid had fled, she took it as a sign. The driver, Michael, had warned her during the interview. "Madam Elizabeth is difficult. Nobody lasts." Grace only nodded. "I will last. I have to." On her first day, Elizabeth made her sweep the same hallway 3 times, each time finding a fault no one else could see. She dropped a cup of tea and blamed Grace for placing it too close to the edge. She accused Grace of forgetting to polish the silverware, though she had polished it twice. Grace worked silently. Each insult stung, but each time she remembered Deborah lying in that hospital bed with pale lips and weak breath. For Deborah she would face any storm. The other staff began to whisper about her. Mama Agnes told Michael, "This one is different. She does not fight back." Michael shrugged. "Let's see how long she can take it." One humid evening, Elizabeth invited 3 society friends for dinner. She demanded the dining room shine like a palace. Grace worked until her back ached, making sure every plate and candle was perfect. When the guests arrived, Elizabeth smiled sweetly. But when one of the candles burned out too soon, her smile vanished. She turned sharply and hissed, "Grace, you useless girl. Can't you even keep a simple flame alive?" The 3 women gasped. Grace stood frozen as Elizabeth's voice sliced the air. The guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering behind their manicured hands. Grace lowered her head. "I'm sorry, Ma." Her voice was steady, though her cheeks burned. Elizabeth's friends glanced at each other. One of them, a tall woman with a bright gelly, spoke softly, "Lizzie, maybe it was the breeze." Elizabeth cut her off with a glare. "It is her carelessness." Grace bowed slightly and replaced the candle without a word. The room was silent except for the hiss of the new flame. Elizabeth turned back to her guests, her face a mask of cold beauty. But as Grace stepped away, she noticed something strange. Just for a heartbeat, Elizabeth's proud eyes wavered as if something deep inside had been shaken. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the mansion had grown quiet, Grace cleaned the dining room alone. The air was heavy with the scent of melted wax. A sudden loud noise, like glass smashing, came from upstairs. Grace dropped the candle snuffer. It was coming from Madame Elizabeth's private lounge. Grace climbed the marble staircase, her bare feet making no sound. The hallway lights flickered once, then steadied. From behind the lounge door came a muffled sob, sharp and broken. She hesitated. Madame Elizabeth, the woman who barked orders like a soldier, was crying? Grace knocked lightly. "Madam, are you all right?" Silence. She waited, her hand trembling over the brass handle. Then the door swung open just enough for Grace to see the mess. Shards of a wine glass glittered across the rug like fallen stars. Elizabeth stood in the middle of it, her silk robe stained deep red from the spilled wine. Her eyes, those proud cold eyes, were swollen. "Go," she said hoarsely. "Leave me alone." Grace stepped inside anyway, careful to avoid the glass. "Madam, you might cut your foot." "I said leave." Elizabeth's voice cracked. Grace bent slowly, picking up the sharp pieces with the edge of a napkin. "Let me help," she whispered. Elizabeth sank into the armchair, covering her face with both hands. For a long time, the only sound was the soft clink of glass dropping into the trash bag. Finally Elizabeth spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you know what it's like when the whole world expects you to be perfect?" Grace kept her eyes down. "No, ma. But I know what it's like to have the whole world against you." Elizabeth looked at her, startled. Grace straightened, her fingers nicked by a tiny cut. "My younger sister is in the hospital. She needs surgery we can't afford. Every day I feel like I'm failing her." The room grew still. Elizabeth's lips parted, but no words came. 2 weeks earlier, Elizabeth had been the darling of Lagos society. The new wife of billionaire Colonel Richards, she hosted charity galas in Ikoyi and wore diamonds like second skin. Yet inside the Banana Island mansion, staff whispered of her temper. No maid had lasted more than a month. Before Grace arrived, a girl named Ifeoma had quit after Elizabeth threw a silver tray across the kitchen. Another maid had left in tears when Elizabeth accused her of stealing a scarf. Elizabeth told herself it was discipline, that these girls were careless. But deep down, when the parties ended and the house fell silent, she felt an emptiness she could not name. Colonel traveled often on business. The grand rooms echoed with loneliness. Elizabeth filled the space with expensive furniture and loud complaints, but the nights only grew longer. Now, in the quiet lounge, Grace gently pressed a tissue against her bleeding finger. Elizabeth noticed and quickly stood. "You're hurt," she said, her voice soft with something close to guilt. She fetched a small first aid box from the cabinet and handed Grace a plaster. "Thank you, Ma," Grace said. Elizabeth stared at her hands. "Why do you stay? Others would have left by now." Grace met her gaze. "Because I need this job. And because, sometimes people shout because they are hurting. Maybe they need someone to stay." Elizabeth blinked rapidly. Her chest rose and fell as if she were holding back a flood. A sudden clap of thunder rattled the windows. Rain began to beat hard against the glass, the sound filling the room like a drum. Elizabeth turned toward the dark sky. For a moment she seemed small, a shadow against the storm. Then, without warning, the lounge door banged open. Michael the driver stood there, drenched from the sudden rain, his eyes wide with fear. "Madam, you need to come downstairs. Right now." Elizabeth spun around. "What is it?" Michael's voice shook. "It's Mr. Connell. He just arrived, and he's not alone." Elizabeth froze, her heart thudding like the thunder outside. "Not alone?" she whispered. "What do you mean?" Michael swallowed hard. "He came with a woman." The words cut through the air like a sharp knife. Elizabeth's mind went blank for a heartbeat. She had known Connell was late from his Abuja trip, but with another woman? On a night like this? Grace rose quickly. "Madam?" Elizabeth raised her hand to stop her. "Stay here," she said, though her own knees wobbled. The sound of voices floated up the staircase, Connell's deep tone and a soft, unfamiliar female laugh. Elizabeth's stomach turned. She gripped the banister, her fingers white against the polished wood, and started down. Connell stood in the grand foyer, shaking off the rain. Beside him, a tall, elegant woman in a red dress clung to his arm. Her high heels clicked against the marble floor as she looked around with open admiration. "Elizabeth," Connell said, startled when he saw his wife on the staircase. "You're awake." Elizabeth descended the last few steps with slow precision. "Obviously." The woman smiled politely. "Good evening." Connell cleared his throat. "This is Amaka, a business partner. Her car broke down on the expressway. I gave her a ride." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. The woman's hand lingered on Connell's sleeve a moment too long. "Welcome," Elizabeth said, her voice even but cold. "Michael, prepare the guest room." Michael bowed quickly and disappeared down the hallway. Later, after Amaka retired for the night and Connell closed himself in his study, Elizabeth stood by the tall window overlooking the rain-soaked garden. Grace quietly approached with a tray of tea. "You should rest, madam," Grace said softly. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "Did you see the way she touched him?" Grace hesitated. "Maybe it was nothing." Elizabeth turned sharply. "Nothing? My husband brings a stranger here in the middle of the night and you call it nothing?" Her voice trembled, not with anger this time but something heavier, fear. Grace set the tea down. "Madam, you always look so strong. But sometimes strong people carry heavy things alone." Elizabeth met her eyes. For a moment she wanted to snap, to dismiss the young maid's words. But something in Grace's steady gaze broke the wall around her heart. The next morning the sky cleared, but tension clung to the house like damp air. Connell left early for a meeting, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne. Elizabeth wandered the empty corridors. Every polished surface reflected her own face, pale and tired. She found Grace in the kitchen slicing vegetables. For the first time, Elizabeth pulled out a stool and sat beside her. "I don't know how to fight for my marriage," Elizabeth admitted in a low voice. Grace placed a gentle hand over hers. "Maybe start with kindness, madam. Sometimes kindness changes everything." Elizabeth looked down at their joined hands. The words settled inside her like a slow, steady light. Before she could reply, a loud crash echoed from the driveway, metal against metal, a screech that sent birds flying from the trees. Grace dropped the knife. "What was that?" Elizabeth shot to her feet. "It sounded like a car accident, right outside our gate." Elizabeth and Grace dashed toward the gate. The morning air smelled of wet earth and engine smoke. Michael was already there, waving his arms to stop curious neighbors. A black SUV had skidded across the slick road and slammed into the mansion's iron gate. The front bumper was bent like paper. Elizabeth's chest tightened. "Is anyone hurt?" A man staggered out of the driver's seat, Amaka's chauffeur. His white shirt was stained with blood from a cut on his forehead. I lost control," he gasped. "Madam Amaka, she's still inside." Grace hurried to the passenger side and pulled the door handle. It wouldn't budge. Smoke curled from under the bonnet. Elizabeth didn't think, she threw her weight against the door. It creaked but held. "Stand back," Michael shouted, rushing with a heavy wrench. He struck the door handle twice. On the third hit it gave way. Elizabeth and Grace grabbed Amaka's arms and pulled her out just as a hiss of steam burst from the engine. Amaka coughed violently, her red dress streaked with oil. She looked up, stunned to see Elizabeth's worried face. You saved me," Amaka whispered. Elizabeth swallowed hard, still breathing fast. "You're hurt." Amaka shook her head, tears mixing with rain. It's only a scratch. But, thank you. Minutes later, Connell's car screeched to a stop. He leapt out, his suit jacket flying behind him. Amaka, he cried, rushing to her side. Elizabeth stood back, her clothes damp, watching as Connell checked Amaka's arms and face. Then he turned to his wife. For the first time in months, his voice softened. Elizabeth, you risked your life. Elizabeth met his gaze, her own eyes glistening. I did what anyone would. Connell opened his mouth as if to say more, but Michael interrupted. Sir, we need to call the mechanic and the police. The gate is badly damaged. Connell nodded and took a step toward the house with Amaka. Elizabeth felt Grace touch her elbow. Madam, you're shivering. Elizabeth exhaled, only now noticing the tremor in her hands. That evening, after the chaos calmed, Amaka asked to speak with Elizabeth privately. They sat in the lounge, the scent of antiseptic from Amaka's bandaged arm faint in the air. I need to be honest, Amaka began, her voice low. Connell and I, there is nothing between us. We are partners on a housing project. But I knew you suspected otherwise, and I did nothing to clear the air. Elizabeth's brows lifted slightly. Amaka looked down, ashamed. I was jealous of your life, of what you have. I thought if I made you uneasy I'd feel better. But today, when you pulled me out of that car, her voice broke. You showed me what real strength is. Elizabeth blinked, a tear escaping despite her effort to hold it back. Grace stood quietly by the door, watching the two women. At that moment, the tension that had poisoned the house began to lift like fog after a storm. But as Elizabeth opened her mouth to speak, the sound of a phone ringing sliced through the fragile silence. Connell's phone, vibrating on the glass table. The caller ID flashed, unknown number. Amaka frowned. He told me he had no more late meetings tonight. Elizabeth reached for the phone just as it stopped ringing. Then it started again, louder this time, urgent. Grace whispered, Madam, maybe you should answer. Elizabeth stared at the vibrating phone. Each ring felt heavier than the last. Her hand hovered over it. What if it was something private? But the caller didn't give up. Grace whispered again, Madam, please, it sounds serious. Elizabeth took a deep breath and pressed the green button. Hello. For a moment there was only the crackle of a poor connection. Then a man's voice, tight with worry, broke through. Mrs. Richards? This is Inspector Bamadiel from the Lagos State Police. We need to speak with your husband. It's urgent. Elizabeth's heart skipped. He stepped out of the lounge. What is it about? I can't share details on the phone, the inspector said quickly. Tell him it concerns his Abuja business partner. It is a matter of life and death. The line went dead. Elizabeth lowered the phone slowly. Amaka's eyes widened. Life and death? What's happening? Connell stepped in from the hallway at that exact moment, his brows knitted. Why is my phone in your hand? Elizabeth turned to him, her voice unsteady. The police called. They said it's about your Abuja partner. They said it's life and death. Connell's face drained of color. He grabbed the phone and redialed, pacing. Bamadiel? Yes, it's Connell Richards. I'll come immediately. He hung up, already reaching for his car keys. What's going on? Elizabeth demanded. Connell hesitated, his jaw tight. A huge shipment from the housing project. Someone tried to sabotage it. My partner barely escaped an attack. Sabotage? Amaka whispered. Yes, Connell said, his voice low. It could ruin everything if we don't act fast. He looked at Elizabeth. For a heartbeat he seemed about to say more. Instead he sighed. I have to meet the police. It's not safe to discuss here. When the gate closed behind Connell's car, the house fell into a tense hush. Rain began again, light at first, then heavy, drumming on the roof. Elizabeth sank onto the couch, her thoughts spinning. First Amaka's accident, now this mysterious attack. Grace brought a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. Madam, she said softly, do you see? Life is showing you that pride only builds walls. But when you helped Madam Amaka today, those walls started to fall. Elizabeth looked at the young maid, her heart heavy with things she had never said aloud. I've treated you and others terribly. Grace smiled faintly. You can start over. Kindness is a choice you can make every day. Elizabeth felt tears warm her eyes. She reached out and gently held Grace's hand. Thank you, for staying even when I gave you every reason to leave. A soft peace settled in the room, the first she had felt in years. Hours later, Connell returned, soaked but safe. He found Elizabeth still awake. Without a word he took her hands. Everything will be fine, he said quietly. The police caught the saboteur. My partner is alive. Elizabeth nodded, relief washing over her. She looked at Grace, who stood silently by the doorway, and something inside her finally broke free, pride, fear, all of it. Grace, Elizabeth said, her voice trembling, from today, you are more than a maid. You are family. Grace blinked, stunned. Connell smiled faintly, pulling Elizabeth closer. Outside, the rain eased to a gentle patter, as if the storm that had ruled their hearts had finally passed. And in that quiet night, Elizabeth knew the truth of what Grace had said. Kindness can change everything. If this story thrilled you, don't keep it secret. Like, share, and drop a comment. Don't forget to subscribe to Tales from Africa for more gripping African tales of suspense, mystery, and powerful life lessons.